Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, a place that is slightly less weird than the Twilight Zone. Right, Roger? We're less weird than the Twilight Zone. We're perfectly normal. But the Twilight Zone, man, that was a weird place. So today, Roger and we are talking about the Twilight Zone. And you might say, why the hell are you talking about the Twilight Zone? Wasn't that a television show? Don't you talk about books? Yes, I do talk about books. But today I'm talking about a television show and books. So, yes, today we're talking about Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. A magnificent television show, one of the most important television shows ever created, and one of the best television shows that has ever been broadcast. It was a wonderful show, The Twilight Zone, which I believe, if I'm remembering right, ran from 1959 to what, 55? It ran for a while before I was born. It all came out before I was born. But if you're of my generation, you probably saw a lot of Twilight Zone when you were a kid because it was on all the time. Reruns were always on television. It seemed like on multiple channels when I was a kid. And it was great, man. I loved the Twilight Zone. I still love the Twilight Zone, although I don't watch it as much anymore because I don't have time to watch television. But I do want to watch all those episodes again. It's been a long time since I've watched the Twilight Zone. But man, I watched it over and over when I was a kid. As did a lot of kids my age. We all knew the Twilight Zone. And it has been wildly popular and imitated frequently. And it has returned over and over again in different forms. It reminds me a little bit of the old pulp magazine Weird Tales. You know, Weird Tales had its run and then it was finished. And then Weird Tales was brought back multiple times by other people who were not involved with the original Weird Tales usually. And so there's a new Weird Tales, but it's not the same. It's not the Weird Tales that existed. The Twilight Zone is kind of like that. It came back a few times, the Twilight Zone. And it would come back, its name was the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling wasn't on it. And sometimes it would be good, and sometimes it wasn't so good. But it was never the original Twilight Zone. The original Twilight Zone stands on its own as its own thing. First of all, I think you need Rod Serling for it actually to be the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling created the Twilight Zone, and it was desperately needed at the time. Because from what I understand at the time, television, it was a lot of Westerns and a lot of safe programming. But Rod Serling was a guy, he grew up reading a lot of science fiction and a lot of, weird stuff. He read the pulp magazines and all of that stuff. But as he grew up, he was very progressive in a way. He was very concerned about social issues. And he had a degree of seriousness to him that he wanted to put into his work, and he ended up writing for television. And he kind of became kind of a hotshot writer on television. And so he created this show, The Twilight Zone, which was really interesting because it wasn't science fiction, it wasn't horror, it wasn't fantasy, it was all those things, When you tuned into an episode of The Twilight Zone, you didn't know if it was going to be, horror or science fiction or fantasy or a combination. It could be anything. Once you enter the Twilight Zone, anything weird can happen. And you can get any kind of story like that. But because of Rod Serling's concerns, a lot of the episodes had to do with some of the things that he was concerned about in society, like prejudice and mob thinking and some other things. He started this show in 59, and so he had lived through the 50s. And when I was a kid, it's kind of like now when people my age, they reminisce and they are nostalgic for stuff. It's always for stuff in the 80s or the 90s. when I was a kid, it was the same thing. Guys in their late 40s or 50s would always be nostalgic for the 50s or the 60s. But in reality, the 50s were a pretty screwed up time. And they had 1950s, there were a lot of issues in the United States that needed to be worked out. Some of them had been or have been, but a lot of them have not. We're still suffering through a lot of stuff that, we were dealing with in the 1950s. But in the 1950s, unlike now, people wouldn't even talk about this stuff usually. But Rod Serling thought this stuff was important, so he would put a lot of these social issues into his programming, into his television show, The Twilight Zone. And most of the time, it really, really worked. There were times when it didn't. There were times when it just felt like a lecture or too highly moralizing. And his shows, if they had a message, very often that message was not subtle. But subtlety is not always something that you want when you're trying to put a story across. Sometimes you want to be blunt. Sometimes you want to be in your face about things, Sometimes that'll work better for your story and for your audience. And Rod Serling was not writing for people living now. He was writing for people who lived back in the early 1960s. And it had an impact, that show. And it was just fascinating and just of tremendous high quality. Not all of the episodes hold up. Some of the episodes were bad. You can't do as many episodes of a show, I think, as they did on The Twilight Zone and have them all be good. But the ones that were good were incredible. And certainly they had a pretty big impact on those of us who watched the show when we were younger. And for me, one of my favorite things to do, every once in a while, certain television channels would have marathons of The Twilight Zone for like a holiday or something. They'd just play The Twilight Zone all day and all night, which was the best thing ever. I could just sit and watch The Twilight Zone like all day and all night. I could do that, and did when I was younger. And of course, you'd have to do it when they played it. That's another thing about The Twilight Zone that I want to mention, just about television in general. Because the thing I'm talking about today is the Twilight Zone books. Now, of course, the ultimate Twilight Zone book was not written by Rod Serling. The ultimate Twilight Zone book is this one. This is the Twilight Zone Companion, which was written by Mark Scott Zicree. This has had multiple editions. This is an earlier edition. This is from 1983. Is this the first printing? Probably not, but let me see. 1982. Actually, this is from 1982. I think this is the first. This could be the first printing. If you look at this and you know that it's not, let me know. But I think it might be. And it was written by a guy who was just a huge fan of the Twilight Zone, and decided to write this guide to the Twilight Zone. And it's awesome. Every episode, bunch of stuff that you wanted to know about the Twilight Zone's in here. And he writes all about Rod Serling and Rod Serling's career as the creator of the Twilight Zone, and what he did for a while after, like Night Gallery and all that jazz. This is a tremendously valuable book. It's great. I love this thing. And of course, the thing to do is, if you're going to have your own Twilight Zone marathon, is to have this right next to you, For us ultimate Twilight Zone nerds, I'm going to do that one day. I'm going to have my own marathon and just sit around with Rhonda and Zorro, my two companions, and Roger, of course, and we're all going to watch the Twilight Zone for hours and hours, just like in the olden days. But this is a tremendously valuable book if you like this show, and I love that show. And one thing they did with television shows back in the 60s and into the 70s, and even later, was if a television show was at all popular, or perhaps not even popular, a book would be released. They would have books. Every television show had a series of books. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. had a series of books. Star Trek had books. A bunch of television shows had books. The old Planet of the Apes television show, when that came out, that had books. Everything had books. Almost every show had books, so to support the show, and people would buy these because this is back in the old days before there were VCRs, in ancient times, before VCRs, before streaming could magically beam television shows into your house whenever you want to watch them. The only way to watch a television show that you wanted to see was to wait for the exact time that it was broadcast. It's incredible. This is what happened in the old-timey days. We would have to actually check our TV guides. Does that still exist? I imagine not. But we had a magazine called the TV Guide, and it would tell us when television shows were being broadcast on television. And, it would say, okay, Twilight Zone's going to be on at 10 o'clock or whatever. Or, if a movie we want, like, oh my goodness, The Creature from the Black Lagoon is finally on again, and it's going to be on Saturday at 2. And then we would have to be there at Saturday at 2 to watch The Creature from the Black Lagoon, because it was the only time we'd be able to see it till whenever it was broadcast again. It seems barbaric, but those were the times. So that was one reason books about shows and novelizations on movies sold so well, because it was the only way you could experience these shows whenever you wanted to. Now, Rod Serling was a talented writer. He didn't write all of the episodes of The Twilight Zone. Richard Matheson did some. Hugh Beaumont did some. Not Hugh Beaumont, Charles Beaumont. Charles Beaumont did some. Hugh Beaumont was on Leave It to Beaver. But Charles Beaumont did some. But most of them were written by Rod Serling. And he was a talented writer. And so he came out with his own Twilight Zone books, because there had to be Twilight Zone books. And so it was decided, probably by Rod Serling, that he was going to write the books. And so what he did, much like on the early Star Trek books by James Blish, he would take a bunch of episodes, novelize the episodes, and put several episodes into one book, which is pretty much the only thing you can do with a show like The Twilight Zone, where it's an anthology show with half-hour shows. And at the time that these came out, The Twilight Zone was still on television. This was the first book that was released. This is Stories from The Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. And this edition of it, this is the Bantam Pathfinder edition. This is the edition that I first read. This was the first Twilight Zone book that I read, and I immediately searched for the other two and found them. But this was the first one I read, and I was very impressed by it. And a couple years ago, when the pandemic first started, I guess it was March of 2020. It was around there. It was such a Twilight Zone time. It was very strange, and nobody knew where this madness was heading, and what was going to happen. And so it was a weird time to live through, as you all are aware. And so I picked this book up again, and I read it again, and I was impressed by just how good it is and how well it was written, and the quality of the stories themselves, and just how well they work as individual short stories in a book. Rod Serling actually was a really talented writer. Now, this has the episodes The Mighty Casey, Escape Clause, Walking Distance, The Fever, Where Is Everybody, and The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. So it had some good stories in here. And one thing that Rod Serling was happy about doing this is that he was able to change some stuff from the original stories that he had written. Now, all the episodes that these stories are based on are episodes that Rod Serling wrote. So he was novelizing his own scripts, creating his own short stories. So it's all Rod Serling. And there's an interesting note in here, which comes from the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone. Let's see if I can find the right page. The Twilight Zone pilot episode was called Where Is Everybody? Originally broadcast October 2nd, 1959. You may remember this panicky fella from the very first episode of The Twilight Zone. And in the first episode of The Twilight Zone, a guy wakes up, he's in a jumpsuit, he's walking into a town, and the town is empty. There are no people. Where is everybody? He doesn't know. And so he spends a long time in the episode wandering around, talking to himself, wondering where everybody went. And then towards the end of the episode, things get really strange. He starts to remember a little bit about himself, but that doesn't explain where is everybody. It was actually a pretty effective episode, and it was effective enough that it sold the series. So it's due to this episode that we have a Twilight Zone. But thinking back on it, Rod Serling wasn't particularly impressed with it. And there's this little bit from the Twilight Zone Companion that I'm going to read because it has a bearing on this book. Over the years, Serling became increasingly dissatisfied with Where Is Everybody, commenting in 1975 that unlike good wine, this film hasn't taken the years very well at all. Certainly, almost as soon as he finished writing the episode, he must have been unhappy with a totally straightforward ending, devoid of any twists or surprises. For when he adapted the script into a short story for his collection Stories from the Twilight Zone, Bantam, 1960, he altered it, beginning at the point where Ferris enters a movie theater. When he goes into the theater, Serling later explained, there's nobody giving tickets, so he reaches in and takes a ticket, and he walks in and he tears off the stub, and he drops one in the little reticule there, and he puts the other stub in his pocket. And then you play the whole thing. And when he gets out of the isolation booth at the end, and they're carrying him on the stretcher, he reaches in his pocket, and there's a theater stub. Now, that didn't happen in the original episode. There was really nothing weird at the end of the episode. This guy wakes up. It turns out I'm spoiling this. It's necessary. So the guy wakes up who was wandering around all alone in the town. And in the story, he just wakes up. It turns out the whole thing was an Air Force test to see if people can take the strain of being in outer space all alone for long periods of time. But there's no moment where he reaches into his pocket and finds the theater stub, because that would add an element of weirdness that the televised episode didn't. There was no weirdness at the end of the episode, and that bothered Rod Serling, so he changed it so that there was that ending where, in his delusion, he had the ticket stub and put it in his pocket, and then when he woke up later and was being carried away on a stretcher, he reached in his pocket and there was the stub. So he somehow had actually experienced what he had experienced, which was a very Twilight Zone twist. And Rod Serling was happy to finally rework that story and put that in there. And there are little moments like that in here, which makes it really cool. Rod Serling was able to go over these scripts and do them the way he wanted to for the story. Now, he followed this up with other books. There were 3 of them altogether. The second one was More Stories from the Twilight Zone, and I have this really boring cover. This is the really boring cover. And that's because this had been reprinted 100 times. This is the 25th printing. This is the 25th printing of this book, which tells you how popular these books about the Twilight Zone were. And this starts out actually with The Lonely, which was from the first season of The Twilight Zone and is one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. Works beautifully as a short story. Indeed, as all the stories do. Mr. Dingle the Strong, A Thing About Machines, The Big Tall Wish, A Stop at Willoughby, The Odyssey of Flight 33, and Dust. I actually think some of the stories in here work better as stories than they do as original television episodes. Heresy, perhaps, but I think so. Then the last book that Rod Serling did for the Twilight Zone, I believe this was, I think he only did 3. The last one was New Stories from the Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. This one does have a very cool Twilight Zone-y cover, unlike this one. And this one is the, what is it, the 21st? This is the 21st printing. This is the 21st printing. So yeah, these were reprinted over and over. This has the whole truth, the shelter, showdown with Rance McGrew, excuse me, the Knight of the Meek, the Midnight Sun, and the Rip Van Winkle caper. And I think this was it. Now I'm wondering which printing this was. I have to check. Hold on. This is the 22nd printing. Man, a lot of printings on these. And I think eventually all 3 books were combined into one book, which I believe was the complete stories of the Twilight Zone by Rod Serling, something like that. But I think all 3 of them were put into one volume, which you can probably find quite easily on eBay. And you know what? I would recommend this. Certainly if you're interested in the television show. If you're interested in the television show, if you're a fan of the Twilight Zone and you haven't read these books or these stories, you owe it to yourself to do so because they're really interesting. And it's a really interesting experience reading them in this way. It is all pure Rod Serling. So it is Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, which makes it extra cool and well worth the time to hunt these down and read them if you're a fan of the Twilight Zone. And really, why wouldn't you be? Because that show is fantastic. I actually think some of the episodes, like I said, were not great. Some have not aged particularly well. But so what? You know, it was a show written for its time, not written for our time. And yet, so many of the themes, so many of the stories, so many of these episodes are actually timeless. And they have survived quite well into our own era. That's all I have to say about the Twilight Zone. I will catch you next time.